You know, it's actually kind of funny when you think about it. In our day-to-day lives, or especially at the office, we usually have absolutely zero tolerance for people who break the rules, right? I mean, we label them troublemakers, we haul them into HR, or we just try to avoid them altogether. But then you take a step back and look at history. The people we revere the absolute most, the visionaries, the brilliant leaders, the master artists, they were almost entirely rule breakers. So why is that? Why on earth does it actually pay to break the rules?
Well, there's this fundamental clash in how we view deviance. The traditional corporate view, it's pretty much just rooted in fear. It tells us that rule breakers cause trouble, they completely disrupt the chain of command, they create utter chaos, and eventually, well, they just get fired. But the rebel view, which is exactly what we're going to dive into today, shows a completely different reality. It shows us that breaking the right rules actually drives true innovation. It allows people to find these highly effective, truly transcendent ways of working.
Welcome to this explainer on Francesca Gino's absolutely fascinating research into rebel talent. Today, we're going to uncover why breaking the rules at work, and honestly, in life, isn't just about being contrarian or difficult. It's actually a calculated, super powerful strategy for success. We're going to create a clear overview of this whole concept for anyone out there looking to push boundaries, but do it in a really constructive way.
All right, here's our game plan. We'll start off with the rule-breaking paradox, then unpack the specific elements that make up rebel talent, and open up the rebel leadership playbook. After that, we'll talk about fostering happy accidents, and finally, we'll figure out how to discover your very own rebel talent.
Part 1. The Rule-Breaking Paradox. Tradition versus innovation. To really wrap our heads around this tension between rigid tradition and brilliant innovation, let's start with the literal mouth-watering example of someone who just utterly shattered the rules. So, Francesca Gino, the Harvard Business School professor behind all this research, spent 15 years studying different businesses. But to truly understand rebel talent, she actually found herself in the heart of Modena, Italy. Specifically, she was working a shift in the dining room and the kitchen of Osteria Francescana. This isn't just any restaurant. It holds 3 Michelin stars and was actually ranked first in the world's 50 best restaurants. She was there to study the owner and chef Massimo Bottura. This is a guy who built an entire legacy by challenging some of the most deeply entrenched culinary traditions on the planet. Picture this classic northern Italian dish called bollito misto. It's a comforting dish, sure, but let's be totally honest here. It's drab. Boiling the meat literally strips it of its vibrant flavor and color. But tradition says, hey, this is simply how the dish is done. Well, Chef Bottura looked at this and completely rebelled. He created bollito non bollito, which translates to boiled meats, not boiled. He used a sous vide technique, sealing the meat in a vacuum pouch to maintain really precise temperatures, which perfectly preserved those intense flavors. Then, taking inspiration from his time in New York, he plated the cubes of meat to look exactly like a skyline of skyscrapers rising up above a Central Park lawn made out of green parsley and pepper gelatin. It literally leaves diners speechless. Bottura actually has this absolutely brilliant philosophy on all of this. He says, you don't let tradition bind you, you let it set you free. And that just perfectly captures how rebels operate. They don't just ignore the past out of ignorance, right? They master it, and then they strategically break it to create something vastly superior. So let's get crystal clear on our definition here. Rebel talent is not about just being a jerk or breaking things just to watch them burn. It's actually about people who question assumptions, strongly held beliefs, and accepted norms, all to identify creative, highly effective ways of doing transcendent work. It is deviance, absolutely, but in a remarkably positive and constructive way. Moving right along to part 2, elements of rebel talent. Let's dig into the actual psychology behind these successful rule breakers and see what makes them tick. Professor Gino basically breaks this down into 5 core paths to engagement that all rebels seem to share. First up is novelty. They actively seek out the new to fight off the boredom of routine. Second is curiosity. They keep that almost childlike impulse to constantly ask why and combat the status quo. Third is perspective. They have this ability to broaden their view and see the world as others do, realizing that their own knowledge is actually incomplete. Fourth is diversity. They challenge predetermined social roles and connect with people who appear totally different from them. And fifth is authenticity, remaining incredibly open and vulnerable to form true connections. When you boil it down, these 5 elements mean that rebels aren't detached at all. They're deeply, fiercely engaged with the world around them.
All right, part 3, the Rebel Leadership Playbook, leading from the trenches. Let's take a quick trip back into history and see how this builds into an entirely new way of leading people. I want you to picture this epic scene. It's July 1798. French soldiers are completely exhausted, they're thirsty, and they are marching under an absolutely brutal Egyptian sun. Off in the distance, the Great Pyramids are just faintly visible. Their leader looks at them and shouts, "Forward! Remember that from those monuments yonder, 40 centuries look down upon you." This is General Napoleon Bonaparte, and he was about to unleash a radically different leadership style on the entire world. You have to remember, back at that time, European armies were incredibly aristocratic and rigid. Promotions were based on wealth and fancy titles, not actual skill. Monarchs and generals kept a very, very safe distance from the actual fighting. But Napoleon, he rebelled against all of it. He fought right there in the trenches alongside his troops. He completely revolutionized warfare by introducing the corps system, moving troops in these flexible mini-armies. He used order mixed, mixing up line and column formations. Basically, he threw out the strict gentlemanly rulebook and started surrounding his enemies with terrifying speed. Now, from a traditional corporate standpoint, a top executive or a general, risking their life in the mud seems completely foolish, right? Why do the grunt work? Well, evolutionary biology explains this perfectly through something called costly signaling. Think about male peacocks lugging around those massive, heavy feathers, or antelopes doing these crazy acrobatic jumps in the air, which is actually called studding, right while a cheetah is chasing them. It's super dangerous, it wastes a ton of energy, but it conveys immense strength. It tells the predator, hey, don't even bother. When Napoleon fought in the mud with his soldiers, that was his costly signal. It proved his talent and his commitment, and it earned him absolute, unwavering loyalty. And we see this exact same dynamic playing out in organizations that flatten their power structures today. Traditional hierarchies rely heavily on top-down control, but rebel leadership, it shares power. Just look at the infamous pirate Black Bart. His ship was actually governed by an article that gave every single person an equal vote in affairs of the moment. Or look at Toyota back in the late 1940s. They actually gave assembly line employees the power to completely halt production if they spotted a problem. By giving up that rigid top-down control, these leaders created massive commitment and productivity. Shared ownership just plain empowers workers to thrive. Moving on to part 4, fostering happy accidents. This next principle brilliantly illustrates how rebel talent can literally save an entire industry when a major crisis hits. Let me throw a massive number at you to really set the stakes here. 400,000. Back in 2012, massive earthquakes completely rocked the Emilia-Romagna region of Italy. 37 different factories were severely damaged. Hundreds of these huge shelves collapsed, and 400,000 enormous wheels of Parmigiano Reggiano cheese just tumbled to the floor. Now, think about this. At a retail price of around $15 a pound in Italy, these damaged wheels couldn't just be sold normally. This disaster was threatening losses in the hundreds of millions of dollars. It placed an entire $2.3 billion regional industry in absolute jeopardy. People were terrified they were going to lose family businesses that had been around for generations. Enter Chef Massimo Bottura again. Having grown up eating this cheese literally straight from the wheel, he knew he had to do something. So he asked himself a really radical question. What if he came up with a brand new dish that had this almost magical damaged cheese as the absolute star? He used his rebel talent to devise a recipe, risotto cacio e pepe. It was totally delicious, but more importantly, it was simple enough for families everywhere to cook at home. The idea was, if everyone wanted to make this dish, they would go out and buy the damaged cheese. And guess what? It totally worked. The idea spread like wildfire. All 400,000 wheels were sold. Not a single cheesemaker went out of business. Guys, this is the ultimate proof of the power of novelty and perspective. By taking an absolute disaster and completely pivoting to view it as a culinary opportunity, a rebel literally saved an entire regional heritage. Which brings us to part 5, discover your rebel talent. So how do we actually take all this and apply it in our daily lives and our own careers? Well, becoming a rebel is a process, and you can absolutely practice it. Step 1 is to learn everything. Take legendary UCLA basketball coach John Wooden. He famously made his star players practice lacing their shoes perfectly. You really have to master the fundamentals first. But then comes step 2, forget everything. Remember how Chef Bottura created a dish highlighting 5 different ages and textures of Parmigiano? He He had to utterly forget how it was supposed to be served. Once you know the rules inside and out, then you can creatively break them. And finally, step 3, lead from the trenches. Whether it's the CEO of Frontier Airlines going undercover to load baggage, or you just getting your hands dirty with your own team, you've got to be right there where the action is to truly understand the work.
If you're sitting there wondering where your own natural disruptive strengths might lie, Francesca Gino's team actually created a really cool tool for this. You can hop over to rebuilttalents.org to find your rebel quotient. It's an awesome resource to help assess whether you're the kind of rebel who naturally speaks hard truths to a boss, or maybe you're the kind who constantly seeks out new perspectives on completed projects.
And that really leaves us with one final, pretty provocative question to wrap up this explainer. What type of rebel are you? Look, there are incredibly strong habits pulling all of us toward the familiar, the safe, and the comfortable every single day. But as we've seen today, breaking those habits and breaking the rules is really the only way to truly innovate, to fiercely engage with the world, and to create your own lasting success. So don't be afraid to break the mold. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I will catch you on the next one.